I unapologetically embrace the view that to some degree insulin resistance is a common root cause for most chronic diseases.
Obviously, type 2 diabetes,
Yeah.
obesity's in there.
Alzheimer's, fatty liver disease, infertility.
So why is that?
Insulin is one of the few peptide hormones that will literally affect every single cell of the body. For example, the connection between insulin resistance and breast and prostate cancers. I'm not saying insulin resistance is the singular contributor, not at all, but it is absolutely a contributor.
Welcome back to the podcast. I'm very excited to be sitting here with Dr. Ben Bikman, who is a professor of cell biology at Brigham Young University. A lot of people that have normal blood glucose levels, quote unquote, can actually be insulin resistant.
Right.
Why is that? And what is this state of like pre-diabetes and why is it something that is not caught sooner?
Yeah. And yet so common. Right. I mean, that adds an extra layer of reason to talk about this because it's become the most common problem. Much of modern clinical care has what I call a glucosecentric paradigm when it comes to monitoring metabolic health or even cardiometabolic health, given how relevant diabetes and metabolic problems are to cardiovascular disease. But the consequence of the glucosecentric paradigm, and there's reasons for it, so I don't mean to state this in any kind of incriminating way. They have their own justification for the glucosecentric paradigm, but it's increasingly harder to overlook because of what we know with regards to insulin. So insulin resistance is the state where insulin levels are higher, the body's having to use more and more insulin in order to keep glucose in check. But because it is able to keep glucose at that normal range, it flies under the clinical radar because of our glucose-centric paradigm. The conventional clinician is only measuring glucose every time the patient's coming in for an annual visit, with no regard to the patient's insulin levels. If we were able to broaden the paradigm a little bit and include insulin, then all of a sudden we are measuring the earliest signs of insulin resistance because it is insulin itself that ought to be measured when we're trying to get that view of the patient's not only metabolic health, but insulin resistance. So to state all that another way, type 2 diabetes is when both insulin is high, but it's starting to really lose the war. And now glucose rises as well. Then the conventionally trained clinician says, the glucose is elevated, so you have diabetes or pre-diabetes. But in its earliest stages, the glucose is still normal, but there's this cold war happening in the body where the insulin levels are still 2 or 3 or 4 times higher than they used to be. It needs to be that high, and it's working well enough to keep the glucose in check. And so the glucocentric paradigm has us miss the earliest metabolic canary in the coal mine, which is insulin. So the sooner our paradigm with modern medicine includes insulin, then the earlier we can detect these metabolic problems in a person who's progressing towards type 2 diabetes. But also, it changes the treatment protocol too, because not to go off on a tangent too soon off the very first question here, but if the longer we ignore the insulin, the more the clinician may be tempted to push the insulin up even higher by giving, say, a type 2 diabetic an insulin therapy. Now they're pushing the insulin from high to super physiological, all in an effort to control the glucose, little realizing that in the process you are actually killing them faster because so much of what kills the type 2 diabetic is not the hyperglycemia, it's the hyperinsulinemia and the insulin resistance.
In this world we live in now where continuous glucose monitors are so becoming very popular, many people have them without a prescription, you can get them.
Yep.
Is there any signs or tests using those that people can do to kind of look for this potential problem with, having perhaps high insulin?
Yeah.
In fact, they're not measuring insulin, but glucose.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So to answer the first the question very directly, I'm an enormous advocate of CGM use. The more we democratize access to CGMs, I think the better we put individuals in a position to be their own coach. They don't need to have someone like me or you berating them and telling them to change their habits and eat a little better. When you see how your body's responding to what you're eating and the CGM enables that, you end up making your own lifestyle changes. So with the use of the CGM, fasting glucose isn't going to be the best indicator. It's going to be the dynamic glucose. So if you've eaten a carbohydrate heavy meal or a simple carbohydrate, I shouldn't call it a big meal, but a simple carbohydrate like 2 pieces of bread. If your glucose levels aren't back down to normal by about 2 hours, that suggests a problem. So in my mind, the greatest utility of the CGM is to monitor the dynamic changes rather than the static, where am I at every morning. That has less value. The dynamic changes are what has value. But beyond the use of the CGM, if a person's curious about their insulin resistance, in many instances, you don't even need to get a blood test. The skin is a window to the metabolic soul, where if there are 2 things you can observe just on your skin, and they're both generally going to be right around the neck. One of them is a condition called acanthosis nigricans, which is when around the little skin fold that most people have around their neck, the skin will get darker pigmented, which can be harder to tell depending on the pigment of the person's skin. But what is obvious regardless of pigment is the kind of crinkled tissue paper texture of the skin. So the skin will be very sort of roughed, like crinkled tissue paper. So that's acanthosis nigricans around the neck. And then the other one people know is called skin tags. And that is those little, it's not like a rounded little mole, but rather a distinct little kind of mushroom stalk column of skin. People probably know what I'm talking about. You can see them around the neck. Sometimes you can see them around the armpits. But again, it's just a teeny little, like a little mushroom stalk almost of skin. Skin tags. Both of those are very, very strong evidence of insulin resistance. And the nice thing is, as the insulin sensitivity improves, those problems go away, just like everything else will.
So many researchers, including yourself, do view insulin resistance as a sort of root of causing many different types of chronic diseases, age-related diseases, obviously type 2 diabetes, obesity's in there, cardiovascular disease,
Alzheimer's, fatty liver disease, infertility.
So why is that?
Yeah.
Something that people think as the root cause of so many chronic diseases. And again, why do you're talking about insulin resistance being common and certainly like this pre-diabetic state being pretty common. What do you think the reason for that is?
Yeah. So the first part of the question, I unapologetically embrace the view that to some degree, that's italicized wording there, to some degree, insulin resistance is a common root cause for most chronic diseases. So I'm not claiming that it's the singular cause. For example, the connection between insulin resistance and breast and prostate cancers, the 2 most common cancers in women and men, respectively. I'm not saying insulin resistance is the singular contributor, not at all, but it is absolutely a contributor. With regards to Alzheimer's disease, insulin is not probably the singular contributor, but it is one, undeniably. And the same goes for polycystic ovary syndrome, the most common infertility in women, or erectile dysfunction in men, and fatty liver disease and hypertension. So in fact, this question is the question I asked myself as an academic at my university. When I got tenure, I looked at the rest at my future career, and I thought, do I want my career to be defined by the number of peer-reviewed papers I publish in science journals? And I thought, no, that's not enough, because most people will never read those articles. No one will ever get a direct benefit from them. And I thought, what would be the one message as a biomedical metabolic scientist that I would want to convey to people? And it was this one. It was that to some degree, most of chronic disease can be attributed to one common origin. And so rather than trimming at the branches of this sick tree where we're giving the patient a drug for their Alzheimer's disease, we're giving them a drug for their hypertension, we're giving them a drug for their infertility. What if all of those were actually just branches coming off of one tree? Let's just cut down the tree. So when we can acknowledge a sort of common soil hypothesis, it starts to simplify the clinical approach. So all of this, in my mind, is a reflection of just how powerful the hormone insulin is. Most individuals only think about insulin as being a hormone that controls blood sugar. which is fantastically unfair. Insulin is one of the few peptide hormones that will literally affect every single cell of the body, from brain cells to bone cells, lung cells to liver cells, and every cell in between. There's no exception. Insulin will have an effect at every cell of the body. And the particular pathology with insulin resistance is unique because you have some cells that aren't responding very well to insulin, like in the case of erectile dysfunction. Insulin is less capable at producing nitric oxide in the endothelium of the blood vessels, so there's less vasodilation. Less vasodilation means compromised erectile function. So on one hand, you have some cells that suffer because they're not responding, but on the other hand, you have some cells that are overstimulated because insulin resistance is insulin not working the same at all cells of the body, and blood insulin levels are higher. So there's too much insulin. Some cells are responding too much to that insulin. So with polycystic ovary syndrome, for example, that's not a problem of the insulin signal not working well. That's a problem of there being too much insulin stimulating the ovary to inhibit the conversion of testosterone into estrogens, and thus she manifests with polycystic ovaries. So to some degree, most chronic diseases can be connected back to insulin resistance. And to me, that has a tremendous power. That's a reason to focus on that disorder.
So some researchers think that the high insulin is more of a response to ectopic fat accumulation, obesity sort of being the underlying cause of the high insulin.
I look at the origins of insulin resistance as being one of two origins, where you have what I call fast insulin resistance and then slow insulin resistance. And what you're touching on is the slow insulin resistance, which I'll come to in just a second. Within the fast insulin resistance side, there are three what I call primary stimuli that in humans have been confirmed, and in rodents and in isolated cell cultures, that can cause insulin resistance quickly, like within hours. But at the same time, if the stimulus is removed, the insulin resistance is resolved in short order. And that is stress. So elevated stress hormones, whether it's cortisol or epinephrine, adrenaline, will cause acute insulin resistance in humans. As that stimulus goes away, the problem resolves. Next is inflammation. If you increase the levels of inflammatory cytokines in cells or rodents or humans, they will be insulin resistant very quickly. In fact, people wearing CGMs may notice this, that the CGM may reveal that they're starting to get a cold or a flu because they notice that their glucose levels, they're having a much harder time controlling them, even though their habits haven't changed. That's often a sign of inflammation. But even with autoimmune diseases, where you have people where the autoimmune disease will ebb and flow, so too will the insulin resistance. It will track very well with how active the disease is. And then lastly, of the primary fast causes of insulin resistance is too much insulin itself. So we know in humans, rodents, and cells, I've published my own work on this topic, that too much insulin will result in a resistance to the stimulus. So too much insulin can cause insulin resistance. Now, none of those touch on what you had mentioned, which is the ectopic idea. That idea is very important, and there's a lot of nuance to it, where we have to define the fat, first of all. And by that I mean what of the hundreds of thousands of types of molecules that we call a lipid or a fat within a cell, which are the ones that actually matter to insulin resistance. Some people will think of just triglycerides, which is the main form of storing fat. And yet triglycerides are totally inert metabolically. There was a case in point, Brett Goodpasture and David Kelly 30 years ago described this phenomenon of the athlete's paradox, where they noted that in obesity with type 2 diabetes and insulin resistance, if you pull a muscle biopsy, there's really high levels of fat in the muscle, of triglycerides. And they're very insulin resistant. And so some people would say, and did at the time, well, high muscle triglycerides causes insulin resistance. And yet, when they did muscle biopsies from very lean, exceptionally insulin sensitive marathon runners, they had just as much fat in their muscle in the form of triglycerides as the obese type 2 diabetics did. And again, they were very insulin sensitive. So it couldn't be the fat that was being stored in the muscle. The same could be said of the liver. If the liver has triglycerides, it's not the triglycerides that are causing insulin resistance. So what is it? If there is any lipid that's to blame, it's going to be a lipid called ceramides. And those do not track the same across the lean marathon runner and the obese type 2 diabetic. When you start measuring levels of tissue ceramides or its precursor dihydroceramides, there's still some debate as which of the two matters most. I'm very strongly just saying it's one of them. And so I'll just say ceramides as a family. You can, in any biological model, cause very strong, robust insulin resistance just by increasing the ceramides, because ceramides will block the insulin signal. When insulin binds to its receptor, then you have a series of phosphorylation events. Ceramides block that very well. It's a very well-defined pathway, and if you can just do one thing and just resolve the ceramides, you correct the insulin signaling. So when it comes to ectopic fat, it's not a matter of how much triglycerides you're storing, but rather what is the entire metabolic milieu to be promoting ceramides in various tissues throughout the body. Interestingly, all of those primary stimuli, the quick insulin resistance, all induce ceramide biosynthesis and accrual. But with the slow insulin resistance, I still think it's appropriate to invoke fat. But by that, it's the fat tissue. And I don't want to get ahead of us, but my view is that if you look at tissue level insulin resistance, is it starting in the muscle or the liver or the fat? I'm very much an advocate of the fat first focus when it comes to insulin resistance. From that slow, progressive, it settles in over years, and it may take, weeks to months in order to reverse.
We're going to get into some of the dietary causes in just a minute, but beyond, we're talking about, you kind of hinted at this earlier, insulin has many roles. And oftentimes the general public thinks about its role in just regulating blood glucose levels. But maybe you could just talk about some of the other roles insulin plays, for example, in fat accumulation.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Yeah. In fact, I've already touched on a few. Like, for example, who would have imagined that insulin regulates the enzyme that's responsible for the conversion of testosterone to estrogens, for goodness sake? And yet it does. Insulin has a direct inhibitory role on aromatase, that enzyme that mediates the conversion and the synthesis of estrogens in men and women. It also regulates nitric oxide production, regulating dilation of blood vessels, and other hormones throughout the body that affect water retention, salt signaling, neuron conductance of signals, and more. But at the fat cell, insulin probably has its most powerful effect, where you cannot now we're touching on a broader topic of why do we get fat here, and I welcome that topic. In fact, of all the human tissue I've studied the most in my lab, it's fat tissue that when we started doing fat biopsies in my lab a few years ago, and that's the tissue we study the most. So I'm very comfortable talking about adipose tissue physiology. There is, as much as there is the debate in two camps of what makes fat cells grow, it's just purely a matter of thermodynamics, or no, it's purely a matter of endocrinology. The truth is, of course, you actually have to have both. You cannot, under any circumstance, make a fat cell get big unless you have both. Just to put a fine point on that, if you have all the calories in the world, so I grow fat cells in Petri dishes in my lab. Right now, back at BYU, I got students growing fat cells in the incubator. They are swimming in a culture medium filled with calories. Everything the fat cell needs is all the calories that fat cell could ever want are around it right now. And yet they're teeny little cells. They're not getting big at all until we add one thing. And the moment we add insulin into that culture, now the fat cells start to get big. If we check them 6 hours later, there's a big lipid droplet. 6 hours still later, it's even bigger. So in other words, the fat cell knows what to do with the energy that it has access to. A cell doesn't have any kind of intuitive intellect to think, okay, there's calories here, or more accurately, carbons that I can turn into triglycerides, and I'm going to take them in and store them. But in the context of the body, the fat cell needs to know, am I playing nice with the rest of the body? How stupid would it be if we got up and we go out on a jog outside, our fat cells are breaking down triglycerides as free fatty acids by activating lipolysis, and yet at the same time they're pulling them right back in to store them. That would be stupid. The fat cell wants to cooperate well and be part of the orchestra of the body, and so it will be releasing its fat so that the muscle can take it up. But if insulin were elevated, so insulin acts as the signal, basically, telling the fat cell when it's time to eat and when it's time to share. So, and then if we flip it, in fact, actually, I'll stay there for one more second. We even see this. Someone could say, well, Ben, that's just in fat cells. What about humans? In fact, humans provide the most convincing evidence of all that you cannot get fat unless insulin is elevated, because one of the more common eating disorders among young people with type 1 diabetes is a condition called diabulimia, which is this terrible, tragic scenario where the person feels such pressure to be lean, and they have learned that that little syringe of insulin is the absolute gatekeeper of the fat cell. So they will deliberately underdose their insulin in order to stay as thin as they want. They can eat as much as they want, and as long as they underdose their insulin, and it's not even at zero, they're just doing a deliberately lower dose, they will be as skinny as they want. Now, there's metabolic hell to pay, right? They're hyperglycemic, they're getting into ketoacidosis, so they're dying, but they'll be as thin as they want. So as much as people want to say, no, it's just calories, we have a human case study that absolutely proves that wrong, that it's not just calories. Now, having said all that, I'm not claiming calories don't matter, because on the other hand, if you just have high insulin in the absence of sufficient calories coming in, that's also incompatible with life, and the person will die. Because if you and I were fasting, in fact, Dr. George Cahill did these studies about 40 years ago. You could never get IRB approval to do it now. He would fast men for days and then give them an insulin dose and drive their glucose levels down to about 20 milligrams per deciliter, just to see how low could the glucose get and the person maintains consciousness. And they did. But suffice it to say, if you spike insulin, which is telling the body to store energy, but there's not energy coming in, then the total energy available in the blood drops to essentially zero. Glucose goes down to zero, ketones go to zero, fatty acids go to zero because you're inhibiting lipolysis, you're inhibiting ketogenesis, you're stimulating glucose uptake. Now the brain has no energy because it doesn't have a reserve of energy like the liver or the fat cells or the muscle. And so as blood energy goes to essentially zero, the brain shuts off. So coming back to the fat cell, you have to have both. You have to have elevated insulin sufficient to tell the fat cell to store that energy, but then you have to have the energy to store. So calories matter, but so too does the insulin stimulus, because in the absence of the insulin stimulus, there is no such thing as fat storage. And indeed, the body can't stop breaking down the fat. And in fact, that's what ketones are. Ketones are nothing more than a sign of the liver burning a lot of fat, where it's burning so much fat, it has such an abundance of acetyl-CoA that it can no longer feed the acetyl-CoA into the citrate cycle because it's too full. It cannot divert it to lipogenesis because insulin's low, so that pathway's inhibited or not activated. And then the only other option of all that acetyl-CoA is ketogenesis. So ketones are simply sort of this overflow, this metabolic release valve of fat burning. But they go one step further, if you'll allow me, where how do we then reconcile it? What is it about insulin? Like I'm not saying calories don't matter. I'm not trying to break the laws of thermodynamics. In fact, my PhD is bioenergetics. I have a unique appreciation for energy in organisms so that those carbons need to be accounted for. But the more insulin is low, you have two adaptations that allow the body to stay lean or to not store that excess as excess that they're eating as fat, which is one, a higher metabolic rate by several hundred calories a day when insulin goes down. So the body's just burning a little hotter. The engine is revving higher. So the overall energy expenditure is up again by 200 to 500 calories a day. And when you're in ketosis, you're eliminating ketones through the breath and the urine. And every ketone that a person's breathing out or urinating out has a caloric value roughly similar to glucose. So you're just excreting calories from the body. So the net effect of all of that can be up to 800 or so calories a day that the person's just wasting.
Because there's nuance here.
Oh, yeah, there is.
Kind of get into it.
In fact, a big nuance is the calories. And this is where I need to be careful because the degree of studies that have looked at these interventions that you're alluding to, and I'll touch on more now, in low calorie or hypercalorie, it's not been fully fleshed out. But I would think it's safe to say if there's a caloric deficit, then it becomes less relevant which of the balance of saturated fats to refined carbs. Now, then someone would say, well, then let's just always live in a caloric deficit. Yeah, good luck with that. I mean, if it were that easy, then people would just shrug their shoulders and say, okay, I'm just going to be on a low calorie diet for the rest of my life. So
if you're in a caloric deficit and you're eating, some refined carbs, then it's not necessarily
wiggle room.
You have more wiggle room.
I think you do.
Insulin resistance.
Yeah. I'm comfortable saying that. And then again, I just have to counter that by saying that's not really feasible long term. People get hungry.
Or healthy.
Hunger always wins. Yeah.
You
got to eat.
Nutritious.
Yeah, you got to eat. You got to fuel the body. So you can't be in that kind of chronic low calorie state. So my view on saturated fats is one of the more polarizing topics, and I'm very comfortable talking about it because my entire postdoctoral fellowship was looking at, I shouldn't say entire, my biggest paper ever published was looking at the degree to which different fatty acids are capable of causing insulin resistance through the conversion into ceramides. And I'm going to upset some people, but in cell cultures, if you treat cells with saturated fat palmitate, which is the main saturated fat in the body, you get insulin resistance very quickly. Now, if you block ceramides, you resolve that insulin resistance. If you treat those cells with monounsaturated fatty acid, no insulin resistance. If you treat those cells with polyunsaturated fatty acid, no insulin resistance. So as much as there is, and I believe it's justified, a very heavy focus on seed oils, I approve of that focus. I think they're pathogenic, but I grimace when people invoke them as a primary cause of insulin resistance because the data do not support it. Again, I think they're very harmful, but not when it comes to insulin resistance because you can, in fact, we would treat cells with palmitate, cause insulin resistance, co-treat them, co-incubate the cells with either oleic acid or linoleic acid, and we would reverse the insulin resistance. Now, I do not mean to give seed oils a pass. I think they're highly pathogenic, but not with insulin.
Well, there's other dietary sources of linoleic acid.
There are, and you can't even avoid them. Really, yeah, and meat. I mean, literally any animal source of fat, any animal food has some linoleic acid in it. It's ubiquitous. You would just want to control it, I guess. So, with regards to saturated fat, that my own work when I published that paper in 2010, maybe, I left that project with this idea that saturated fats are thus a cause of insulin resistance. And I had to challenge my own assumptions when I saw the work of Dr. Jeff Volek, a friend and a legend in the realm of low carbohydrate studies, because he published some incredibly compelling papers. Over a few papers, he found that I had to sort of challenge the model where I thought, all right, I was treating cells with saturated fat. Is that the same as a human eating it? And of course it's not. And now to touch on his work, you can have humans that if the carbohydrate levels are going down, they can eat 2 or 3 or 4 times more saturated fat than a high carb group. And then they're circulating levels of saturated fat. So the saturated fat in the plasma is significantly lower. That's because most of the saturated fat that's flowing through our veins is coming from the liver. When the liver is told to make fat through de novo lipogenesis, the fat that it makes is palmitate. So most of the saturated fat we have flowing through our blood that's going to get to a cell is going to be coming from what the liver's making, not from what we're eating. And he showed this very, very well.
But that's only in the background of low carb.
Exactly. Yeah. So in fact, I won't even elaborate more on that if that point's clear. So the lower carbs are getting, the more you can eat saturated fat and appear to have no deficit. I'm very comfortable with that.
No deficit in...
No problem with insulin resistance. Yeah.
Okay.
And indeed...
But calories aren't an issue in that context, really.
I don't recall whether they had it in a low-calorie context or not. I would suspect because insulin is low, once again, you probably have a little more of that metabolic wiggle room with the higher metabolic rate and then the ketone wasting, so it starts to get a little cloudy.
So the saturated fat scenario is that there is definitely a pathway to insulin resistance. Mm-hmm. However, it seems as though if you're more of a ketogenic type of eater, low carb ketogenic type of eater, that pathway doesn't seem to be relevant.
I'm very comfortable with that. Yeah, in fact, that's a great way of stating it. That the lower the carbs are getting, the less the dietary saturated fat matters. Now, in the context of a higher carb diet, as much as it pains me to admit, because I'm such a defender of saturated fats, there are a couple studies that are very well done. If I recall, it was some groups in Europe, in the European Journal of Clinical Nutrition, where they had, in the context of a high carb diet, and then manipulating the saturation of fats, the high carb and high saturated fat was the worst for insulin resistance and insulin signaling. And so when it comes to, again, the background of high carb, then as much as it pains me to admit, because I'm such a defender of saturated fats from natural sources, which is where they come from, that begins to be problematic.
I think it's problematic, and not just, for metabolic health, but cardiometabolic health. I mean, that's where you get small dense LDL particles. Again, it's the combination of the saturated fat and the refined carbohydrates. Now, are we talking about when you're having a high saturated fat diet in combination with what you call carbohydrate, high carb? I mean, what if you're eating, fruits and vegetables and, maybe some oats? Is that the same as eating cookies and processed foods?
Right. Yeah, no, of course, the easy answer would be no, but I can't recall the specifics of that study. And anytime I can't cite a study, I want to be careful in the answer. But my view would be, what is the underlying insulin effect of those carbs? So if these are low glycemic load type carbs where the insulin response is going to be very modest,
right?
Insulin itself causes insulin resistance, and again, rapidly. And so what I think is, if you take the context of an insulin spike with a saturated fat load, that's uniquely harmful with regards to insulin resistance. So back to the idea of what are the carbs, I think if you're talking about the low glycemic load carbs, like cruciferous vegetables and berries and citrus fruits, for example, no, there's almost nothing. And then you chase that down with a tablespoon of coconut oil, the most concentrated form of saturated fat on the planet, I think you're fine. Well, coconut oil is a bit of an outlier because so much of it's MCT, which is not a substrate for ceramides, so it doesn't quite fit. But in that case, no, I think that would be perfectly fine. But you are touching on what is, to me, the obvious villain. As much as we have increasingly two camps of people saying, no, it's the seed oils. And I'm generally more, just because I'm an insulin resistance guy, no, it's refined starches and sugars. The fact is they always come together. And so the more a person has a dietary ideology that's just simply based on the idea of don't get your carbs or don't get your food from bags and boxes with barcodes, you're getting rid of both the refined starches and sugars and the refined oils. Anything else is going to be fine for most people. Just less bags and boxes with barcodes, more whole foods, you're fine.
But what about like fructose versus glucose? If you're having more fructose in the fruit, is that really causing the same insulin response as a refined?
No, it's not. No, it absolutely is not. No, fructose itself will not elicit an insulin response whatsoever. Now, the body will convert some of that fructose to glucose, which is why the diabetic who's gone hypoglycemic can just drink a cup of orange juice, and within minutes, it'll start to, that's such a concentrated load of fructose that they will see a glycemic excursion. But no, fructose isn't the same. But even still, depending on the person, you and I were two lean, healthy people, we could get away with it. If I'm talking to an overweight type 2 diabetic, then I say, all right, well, the most sugary of the fruits, just be more careful with, like say a mango or a banana. Then I would say, all right, you maybe want to be a little more careful because your disorder is you don't burn glucose, you don't burn sugar very well. And so you just be careful with the most sugary of the fruits, but then everything else enjoy liberally.
So with respect to insulin resistance and weight loss and obesity and what's causing, like the cause of these things, right? I mean, this is where we get into, there's also this sort of war between saturated fat versus sort of a high carb diet, and can you lose weight on one or the other better? And that's where Kevin Hall's study was kind of interesting. I'd love to get your thoughts because, so he's published this study back in 2021, NIH did a pretty well-controlled study where people were on a higher carb diet or they were on a ketogenic diet. They were isocaloric, so same calories. But if I recall,
No, in fact, they were able, it was ad libitum. And then they found that the plant-based group just spontaneously ate less. So the 2021 study, one of the powers of that study, and it's not a perfect one, which I can articulate, was that they allowed them to just eat freely. but you got to follow these kind of balance, and you follow this pattern, you follow that pattern. And if I recall, the plant-based, he rejoiced in the fact that it challenged the carbohydrate insulin theory of obesity, which I can articulate in a moment, because they found that the higher carb group spontaneously ate about 700 calories a day less. Does that sound right? I think that's right. Mm-hmm. So they just spontaneously were eating less because they could eat freely. They just ate, and 700 calories a day is a meaningful amount to just spontaneously eat less of. That did challenge the idea, because one view I actually don't like.
But did they lose more fat as well?
Yeah, they did. They did. Yeah, but this is modest. I mean, to be fair to the study, they did a good job controlling it. To be a little critical of the study, the findings were exceptionally modest. This is the kind of thing where it was like 1 pound versus 2 pounds, and it was 2 weeks. And it was a very small study. And a lot of what Kevin has done is a lot of these kind of mathematical modeling outcomes where they sort of speculate or extrapolate beyond the data that they get. So they found that they spontaneously ate 700 calories a day less. That challenged one of the central ideas of the carbohydrate insulin model, which is if you spike insulin, you get hungry. And he was saying, well, they ate all these carbs. Mind you, it was mostly plant-based.
Complex carbs.
Exactly.
With fiber.
So that's right. And so it's a little unfair, because that's not how most people are getting their carbs these days. And just to put a fine point on that point, 70% of all calories consumed globally, it's about 60% in the US, are carbohydrates. And they're not coming from leafy greens and berries and citrus fruits. It's coming from bags and boxes with barcodes. But nevertheless, that's an interesting finding. My criticism of that is, one, it's an extremely short-term study, and there are longer studies that we ought to highlight just to offset this very short study. But at the same time, when you're eating so much fruits and vegetables, you're putting a lot of bulk in your stomach. And it didn't surprise me that these may be people who, within just 2 weeks on this diet, were just probably having a lot of bloating and gas from eating a lot of plants when they probably weren't eating that many plants before they started the diet. So it didn't entirely surprise me that they were spontaneously eating less. I would personally enjoy eating more meat than I would big leafy greens and other fruits and vegetables. So I would probably eat more calories. The fact at the end of the 2 weeks, in fact, what's funny is I looked at the outcome and thought, okay, the low carb group was eating 700 calories more per day, and you're telling me they only gained like they only had 1 more pound of fat? If anything, you could have looked at all that data and said, wow, there is a metabolic advantage to a low-carb diet. And in fact, some of the studies Kevin Hall, of his own work that he's tried to distance himself from, is finding that in a ketogenic state, people have a significantly higher metabolic rate. And so perhaps one outcome of that study is that when a person gets to ketosis, they were able to eat 700 calories more per day and only had 1 more pound of fat than the other group did. That, to me, is a pretty big win. Over 100 years ago, 2 famous, legendary scientists, Francis Benedict, who you and I may recall created what's called the Benedict equation, which is an equation that is still used to this day to try to assess metabolic rate based on someone's body size. So the Benedict equation, this legend of energy expenditure, he collaborated with Elliot P. Joslin, the most famous endocrinology clinic in the world. The Joslin Diabetes Center is named after him. So you had these 2 legends in their own realm who tried to understand the metabolism of people in what they called severe diabetes, which we would call type 1. They found that their metabolic rate was about 20% too high. And then years later, when insulin began to be a therapy, a group at Minnesota, the first author is Nair, Sri Nair, N-A-I-R, they not only confirmed the findings from 60 or 70 years earlier that in type 1 diabetes, the metabolic rate is too high. Like something's broken, they're burning too hot. But when you gave them insulin, within minutes, the metabolic rate began to slow down. And so all of this, back to that study from 2021, the reason I even brought all of this up is, to me, that's further evidence of the lower insulin gets, like with a low-carb diet, the more metabolic wiggle room a person has, where energy expenditure is up by several hundred calories a day. And we found in human work that part of it is because the fat tissue starts having a much higher metabolic rate when insulin comes down. There's much more mitochondrial uncoupling. So the engine is just revving and burning energy just to create heat. But at the same time, the more you're making ketones, the more you're expelling those ketones, and ketones are calories. And so maybe those 700 calories a day that the low-carb group was eating in excess, the fact that they only had 1 other pound of fat could be that they were just burning the rest off because of these metabolic advantages.
Well, speaking of wiggle room, I mean, we're talking about a variety of scenarios here where people can have wiggle room. We talked about, being in caloric deficit gives you a little more wiggle room.
Yep.
Being in a ketogenic or, close to a ketogenic state seems to give you more wiggle room. But what about being like highly physically active?
Absolutely. Yeah, good. I love how you're framing that with this context, these themes of wiggle room. Where do you have a little bit of margin to work with? Yeah, absolutely. Exercise is one of those other outlet, if you will, where if you have energy that you need to account for, exercise is going to be a wonderful way to do it. I often don't focus so much on exercise because I don't want to convey to people that it can outdo the diet. There was a paper published in Women where they looked at a very structured and intense exercise program with I think it was just low-carb diet. And the low-carb diet had better metabolic improvements than the strength training did. And so diet is going to generally, smartly done diet, so changing nutrition is going to yield better long-term benefits with metabolic health. However, I'm an enormous advocate of exercise. And to me, you are not going to go, it's one thing to be metabolically healthy and lean, but then it's something else to be lean and sick or weak or frail. And that's where, to me, the exercise comes in. So my view is you eat smart to be lean and metabolically sound. You exercise to be strong and capable and metabolically sound. So muscle, of course, is the great glucose consumer. If someone's wearing their CGM and they see the glucose come up and down, 80% of that coming down is what's going in to fuel the muscle. The muscle is just by mass so big and so hungry that the more muscle you have, the more you're going to have this big buffer, or what we're calling wiggle room, where you're going to clear that glucose much, much faster. So if you had 2 people of equal body mass, but one having more fat, one having more muscle, but otherwise the same, and that's a big difference though, I know. They eat the same amount of carbs. The guy with more muscle is going to have his glucose curve come up and down, and it'll be back down to normal in an hour, maybe 90 minutes. The person who has less muscle, even more fat, so same body mass, it's going to take much, much longer for that glucose to come down, and thus it take longer for the insulin to come down, because muscle is the main place where insulin's going to escort the glucose to, and it does so very well. So the more muscle mass a person has, the more sort of metabolic wiggle room they have to clear that glucose, and then the more carbs they can eat. As much as I really point the finger at carbs as a primary problem, the more they can eat. And even to the point where if a person's very active, I knew a guy who was training for a marathon, he would eat over 200 grams of carbs per day and still be in deep ketosis the next morning. Mm-hmm. You'd think, well, no, normally a ketogenic diet's no more than 50 grams. Well, unless you're just burning that glucose.
Right. And also you mentioned this study that was comparing strength training to the, low carb. Right. Well, I think also high intensity interval training, when you're doing, there's a lot of work on, so we're talking about how exercise can improve metabolic health. And I think it is a really important lever to pull here, because you're activating these GLUT4 transporters, and it does that. Like, that activation happens through lactate, the generation of lactate, which is happening when you're really pushing yourself hard. Yeah. And so at that point, you're becoming insulin sensitive too, right? So you're really kind of changing the scenario in some ways. I don't personally think it should give people the justification to go and eat tons of pizzas and ice cream. And
as much as people may look at their day and say, I have 1 hour, I would say everyone, man, woman, old, young, strength train. Maybe someone, I sometimes question my own motivations, where I just think, if I were in a crisis situation, would my ability to run away from the challenge be better than my ability to face the challenge? No, I don't think so, because I'm going to be with my wife and kids, and the fact that I can outrun them isn't going to solve the problem. And so I want to be ready to do something if I need to. But even beyond that silly, dramatic scenario, the bigger the muscle, the hungrier the muscle. And given the time constraints that most people have, but even then, there are studies to show that minute for minute at that shorter end, if a person's spending, I think it was like 30 minutes a day, the strength training group had better improvements in insulin sensitivity than the aerobic training group. So if you have constrained time, and let's face it, everybody does, default to strength training. Whatever degree of strength training you can get, and just to touch on your point about intensity, just try to go to failure. At least at some point during that overall muscle or that movement, it doesn't have to be a high weight, low rep. Even if you're doing a lower weight, higher rep, just get to failure. Yeah, to me, high fat, high carb is the worst combination for every outcome. You'd mentioned cardiometabolic with regards to adverse changes in lipoprotein profile. Absolutely, I agree with that. But high carb and high fat, just bringing it back to the fat cell, you are now giving it a stimulus of insulin, which is telling the fat cell to get big. And the fat cell wants to get big most easily just by pulling in fat, which if you're eating fat, it's going to pull in very happily, but it won't if insulin's low. And so, that's why you can sort of pick which variable you're going to play around with. Not that you've asked this, but then having touched on what causes the growth of the fat cell, naturally that begs the question, well, what shrinks the fat cell? Well, you look at those two levers, the high insulin and the high calorie. You have to pick one. My only worry is, as much as people are so ardently defending the caloric view, which they have for a century now, if you just cut calories without addressing someone's underlying high insulin, you're going to make them hungry very quickly. And that's one of the reasons why I speak to the insulin side. As much as I acknowledge the calorie side, I think that is a step to take. It just shouldn't be the first step. What I like to see as the first step is control your insulin. Okay, how do I do that? Well, reduce your consumption of refined carbs. So make sure you're getting a lot of good protein and fat, and then fruits and vegetables. That's going to help your insulin come down. Don't worry about your calories yet. We'll get there later. And just by focusing on the lowering insulin aspect, you have the metabolic advantages come into place, which is metabolic rate goes up, calorie wasting through ketone excretion goes up, and so you're going to start to lose weight. And then when you get to that next sort of plateau, all right, now we can look at that calorie side. Because with lower insulin, your brain is more accustomed to using ketones now, and you're more accustomed to mobilizing fat. You have more mitochondria because you've been burning more fat with low insulin. Now you can start cutting calories and not have to worry about hunger kicking you out. The most obvious example of the problem with just going after calories without addressing a high insulin would be perhaps like The Biggest Loser, where you never see a reunion tour with those poor contestants because they gain everything back. The advice that we've been giving unofficially since the 1960s, officially since the late 1970s of high carb diet, and then what transitioned into with the food guide pyramid, and then what transitioned into eating multiple small meals per day, I think the proof is in the pudding, which is that's how most people eat. They eat a starchy, sugary, terrible breakfast, then they need a mid-morning snack, and then they need a lunch, then they need an afternoon snack, and then dinner, then an evening snack. We can see the consequences, which is insulin resistance and obesity are the most common problems. Even where obesity is not common, insulin resistance is still common. Not to go on a tangent too much, but even countries like Japan or Singapore, my second home, one of my kids was born there. I did my fellowship in Singapore. Why would the beautiful little island of Singapore care so much about diabetes when the average Singaporean is incredibly lean? Because their rates of diabetes are higher than ours by a lot. We're not even close to the most diabetic country, and that actually comes back to how we store fat. So with regards to meal frequency and what we eat, I think high carb diet with abundant calories, eating multiple times a day is the worst way to do it. So I would think it'd be better to have fewer meals, 2 to 3 meals a day, where you are controlling carbs. So whole fruits and vegetables, enjoy them. And then good proteins and fats, enjoy them liberally. But this isn't convenient in social or family situations, but the more you can stack your meals to be earlier in the day, the better. So studies that have looked at humans finding where they do the kind of intermittent fasting or time-restricted eating of you have one group eat breakfast and lunch, One group eat lunch and supper. The lunch and supper group has worse outcomes. Not that they're not better. I mean, any one of those is better than the standard. But when you compare the two, the outcomes are better for the meals being earlier in the day. Now, you and I are parents. How awkward would it be for me to come home and just sit around the dinner table and look at my darling wife and kids eat dinner while I'm not? I'm not going to do that. The most common cause of insomnia is elevated body temperature. So they're too hot. And one of the most common causes of being too hot is hyperglycemia. Most people don't appreciate that when your blood glucose levels spike, you activate your sympathetic nervous system. And of all the times of the day when your sympathetic nervous system is activated, you don't want it to be turned on when you're trying to go to bed. That's when you want the parasympathetic to dominate. So when someone eats that evening snack of spiking their blood sugar, then they go to bed in a hyperglycemic state, they're going to have all of the signs and symptoms of anxiety. They're going to be laying there hot. Their heart is going to be beating hard and fast, and they're going to feel that pulse pounding and wonder, what am I anxious about? Why can't I just sleep? Well, it's not because you have anxiety. It's because you went to bed hyperglycemic. But unfortunately, that is the one time of day where people are at their weakest. And I'm very sympathetic to that because I feel the same thing. People can walk past treats and junk food all day and deny themselves that, knowing that it's not good for them. But the moment 6 o'clock comes around or 7 o'clock, then all of a sudden the temptation starts to take on a new form and they indulge. And that is the worst time. It would be better for them to indulge in that at lunch, for example, than it would be at that point of the day. Not only metabolically and in maintaining good insulin sensitivity, but not to mention sleep. And then the compounding consequences of poor sleep just creates this vicious cycle where there's so many decades worth of evidence showing that as much as we had that one study suggesting, well, the higher insulin group had less hunger. Yeah, there's a lot of evidence showing the opposite. So where you end up creating this roller coaster of glycemia and hunger where the person eats a starchy, sugary breakfast, which let's face it, most breakfasts are these days. They have this big spike. And then when you go high, you inevitably go low. And then when you go low, hunger comes again. Even though you may still literally have food in your stomach, and yet your brain is starting to sense, well, I'm hungry, because the overall amount of energy in the blood has gone down, even though there's plenty of stuff still in the stomach. But it stimulates hunger. That's David Ludwig's main contributions. So anyway, it puts the person on this roller coaster of glycemia, and every time it comes down, hunger wants to push it back up again. And so, yeah, I cut you off though, but that puts them in a position to eat 6 or 7 times a day. And if they're not eating, they're drinking something sugary, either a soda or a sugary fruit juice. But there is a group that found that when you have a breakfast, and they looked at breakfast, and the name of the article was something like More Rapid Return of Hunger. It was something like Return to Hunger was in the title. And if the breakfast, isocaloric breakfast, so same number of calories, protein was clamped, and it just differed in the ratio of fats to carbs. The high carb group was hungrier much sooner and then ate more for their next meal than the low carb group. And so I would say, as much as we want to be sort of fair with whole plants, if that breakfast is a mix of whole plants with good proteins and fats, that's going to be a winning combination of satiety. When I've worn CGMs, I absolutely see that the single most predictive variable of my glycemia in any given day is how did I sleep. Nothing that I've played around with, nothing has even come close. So when you get one bad night of sleep, the stress hormone, so it fits under the stress category to make it very succinct. So of the 3 primary causes of quick insulin resistance, it's stress when it comes to sleep deprivation. One bad night of sleep will result in a much higher and disrupted rhythm of cortisol. And so cortisol will cause insulin resistance in every biological model very quickly. So too will epinephrine. And epinephrine is another stress hormone, sort of the faster stress hormone, the cortisol being a little more delayed. But both of them are higher with regards to sleep deprivation. And even epinephrine, even adrenaline can cause insulin resistance in humans. If you do a steady little drip in a human of adrenaline, they're going to be insulin resistant, demonstrably insulin resistant within just an hour or two. So that's how sleep deprivation causes insulin resistance. And to make matters even worse, what is the most common intervention to try to offset the negative consequences of sleep deprivation? Well, it's more caffeine. Well, more caffeine is going to increase epinephrine even more, epinephrine causes insulin resistance. So even the solution to the sleep deprivation ends up inadvertently compounding the metabolic consequences of the sleep deprivation. Now, that's not to say it's not to say caffeine doesn't have some metabolic benefits. It can when used correctly, like I would say when used in the context of performance. But for someone who's trying to offset the consequences of their sleep deprivation, you may have some increased alertness, yes, but the metabolic consequences of the sleep have now just been added on. So to articulate what we've done so far, we've published reports looking at PM 2.5 diesel exhaust particles, and we published another report looking at cigarette smoke. With the cigarette smoke particles, that was purely in the context of ceramides, forced mitochondrial fission, and insulin resistance, and the cigarette smoke did all of those things. The newer paper that we published about a year or two ago was, I think, the first to find that if you just have increased diesel exhaust particles, even when we calorie clamped these, we pair-fed these animals, and the animals that were inhaling more of the diesel particles at physiological levels, like at a level that a human could be exposed to, they had much fatter fat cells. So they had much more adipocyte hypertrophy, which accounted for a higher body fat mass, even though they were eating the exact same amount of calories. Again, we pair-fed them. We only let them eat as much calories as the other group was eating, and they still had more fat. So it does suggest that there are non-nutritive stimuli. You'd mentioned some others. We've not done work on microplastics or the plasticizers, those like diethylstilbestrol and BPA, but those also have been shown to promote greater fat expansion in the absence of calorie changes. That's another reason why I think that we don't do ourselves any favors when we only have a calorie-centric view of obesity, because there are more variables that come into play here. Now, to answer that last part of your question, which is to what degree should the average person be worried about that? It pains me to say this because it's my own work. I think that's a lower tier concern. It's also one that some people may not literally be able to do anything about. We have just what's preliminary data now. When we look at the superheated particles, which is what you're inhaling, we're finding, we haven't published this yet, so this is unpublished. My master's student, this is her thesis project right now, so the data is forthcoming. But the early data suggests that it actually at a relatively controlled dose, matching it for the cigarette smoke dose that we used previously, it's worse. So now, I can't speak to the consequences of the tumorigenesis effects, like maybe the person's going to have slightly better outcomes with cancer. But when we're looking at the outcome we've measured so far is mitochondrial outcomes, looking at the degree to which the mitochondria can take in oxygen and convert it to ATP, rather than the oxygen being converted into superoxide radical. It's worse with the superheated particles from the vaping than from the cigarette smoke.
Do you think this is coming down to nicotine or
I don't know.
Other things in the vape?
I don't know. So we have just the whole animal data so far, and then the next step will be isolating individual particles to try to find out, all right, which culprit, if one culprit is more to blame with regards to the e-cig exposure versus the cigarette, because it is different chemicals.
There's a whole host of commonly prescribed medications out there, from lipid-lowering medications like statins to antidepressants and other neuropsychiatric, disorders and medications that help with those disorders. What is that something to be concerned about?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, it absolutely is. And I'll just mention one that you just mentioned, which is statins, just because of how common they are. So there's no evidence that statins that I'm aware of are going to create weight gain, but there are metabolic consequences to messing with cholesterol. Lest people forget, cholesterol is a precursor to an essential component of the electron transport system. And so it's no surprise that if people are waging war on cholesterol synthesis, the mitochondria may suffer. And in women, middle-aged and older women have a 50% greater risk of developing type 2 diabetes when they get on a statin. That's a meaningful increased risk. Women appear to be much more susceptible to the consequences of statins, metabolic consequences of statins, not to mention the increased risk of Alzheimer's and even certain cancers that come with statins. Now, I'm not intending to sound like I don't think there's ever a place for statins, but I do think they're overprescribed. Now, more heavily metabolic, any steroid that's been prescribed to control inflammation is going to be deeply problematic for weight gain. So if a person has an autoimmune disease or a chronic inflammatory condition and the clinician has prescribed a corticosteroid they're going to gain weight very, very quickly, because that starts to play on that stress pathway, where the more cortisol is that pathway is being activated, which is what that's doing, the more you're going to make the body insulin resistant. Higher insulin promotes fat gain. And then, just for the sake of time, perhaps I just mentioned the atypical antipsychotics. Any drug that ends with an apine at the end of it, the suffix being apine, is generally going to promote weight gain. That's probably through a central insulin resistance of the hypothalamus. When the hypothalamus becomes insulin resistant, you have a reduced satiety signal, and the person's just going to start eating more. We published a clinical report. So collaborating with a local clinic in Utah, we took 11 women with newly diagnosed type 2 diabetes, and their A1C was 8.9%, so very much diabetic range. And the physician, who's very much on board, had given these patients two options. And he said, you can leave the office with a prescription for an anti-diabetic drug, like metformin, or you can meet with a nutritionist and go through this lifestyle nutrition counseling. And in just 90 days, their A1C went down. The average A1C, the average was 8.9, and it went to 5.6. So no sign of diabetes whatsoever after just 90 days without a pill popped or a needle injected. So I have often taken that 90-day span as a very reasonable amount of time to reverse insulin resistance. Now, depending on the scope of the problem, it may take a little longer to get rid of all of the consequences of the insulin resistance, but I think 90 days is a very reasonable, justified timeline. Again, I say justified based on our own evidence. Now, what did we tell them? That could sort of segue into the first part of your question. We gave them, in fact, just 3 pieces of advice based on the 3 macronutrients. And I've actually kind of already alluded to this, which the first one is control carbs. And that was simply this admonition to eat whole fruits and vegetables. You don't even need to count it. Just whole fruits and vegetables. But in the case of these type 2 diabetics, we said try to be mindful of the most sugary fruits and or the starchy fruits and vegetables. So the tropical fruits, we said please be careful with, like bananas, pineapples, mangoes. And then the starchy, if the vegetable grows in the ground, eat less of it relatively. But all other fruits and vegetables, and that's still a lot, enjoy liberally. And then prioritize protein and don't fear the fat that comes with that protein. And that was an important caveat because we didn't want them to be drinking fat, but we wanted them to acknowledge that in nature, all protein comes with fat. Don't be afraid of that fat. When humans eat fat with the protein, we digest the protein better, and it's more anabolic. There's studies in humans to show that if people work out, give them protein, they'll have a certain degree of muscle protein synthesis. If you give them protein and fat, it's even higher than it was with just the protein alone. Yeah, and that's, most people don't appreciate that bile, when the gallbladder from the liver releases the bile into the intestines, we always just think of that as being relevant to fat digestion. And it's critical for that, but it also enhances proteolytic enzymes. It makes the proteolytic enzymes more active, better. They work better, so we digest the protein better. And that may be the mechanism that explains the enhanced muscle protein synthesis from the combination. So that was the dietary advice we gave them, and I would just say that for people, that manage your macros, control carbs, prioritize protein, don't fear fat. If people are wondering what's the best exercise, my somewhat pithy answer is the one you'll do. Just do something. If you can do the sort of higher intense strength training that we were talking about, then please do it. But if this is like some 80-year-old grandma who just likes walking around with her girlfriends, just walk around with your girlfriends. Keep doing that habit. Whatever exercise you can do and you're going to do, then just do it. But there is something to be said for timing it, where perhaps you can do your exercise session, if it is a walk around the block a few times with the gals, do that after your biggest meal. Where if you just do 10 to 15 minutes of physical activity after your biggest glucose spiking meal, you will blunt that glucose excursion by half, if not even better. So what would have been a huge, big, long glucose spike and a commensurate insulin dose as well, you're going to cut that down substantially if you do time that little bit of physical activity. And maybe that would be one other comment. If that's not your main exercise, then have that kind of exercise snack where you had your big meal, maybe hopefully it was lunch, go on a 10 or 15-minute walk. Even those of us that, I'm a professor at a university, I can eat my lunch and still just go on a little walk around the campus. My building is so big that in bad weather, I can walk around my building, even like around the hallways. And so just find a way to get up and do something in little bits of activity throughout the day, but then still, as much as a person can, try to have that concentrated time of, all right, I'm working out right now and I'm going to sweat and I'm going to get tired from it.
Are there these supplements that can improve insulin sensitivity? So you hear everything from magnesium to alpha lipoic acid to berberine, apple cider vinegar, and if there's any merit to that, or taking it before a meal, or is this just like dropping like a drop of water in the pool to try to fill the pool up?
Yeah. Well, in fact, every one you just mentioned works. Frankly, the one I like to talk about the most because the evidence is so compelling and it's so easy to get. So berberine is undoubtedly effective. No doubt it works. Berberine absolutely works. I love apple cider vinegar as a personal favorite. Maybe it's because of my old man palate where I like really tart things the older I'm getting. So I just love the taste when I dilute it in water or sparkling water. But apple cider vinegar, that's the shortest of all short chain fats, that acetic acid. And the short chain in the human diet, as much as we eat a lot of fat, most of it is from seed oils and soybean oil, but we lose out on the full spectrum of fats because we don't really eat a lot of fermented foods anymore. So we don't get the medium chain fats, and because we don't eat much fermented foods, we don't get any short chain fats for the most part. So short chain fatty acids, which is what apple cider vinegar is that's a small little molecule that punches well above its weight, where the acetic acid will reduce hepatic gluconeogenesis to help control glucose, which is very relevant in a person with diabetes, especially type 2. There's so much glucagon always in their bloodstream, it's constantly pushing the liver to make more glucose. Apple cider vinegar will inhibit that. And so it helps the blood glucose by just having the liver dump less glucose into the blood. But it also stimulates AMPK. And you'd mentioned GLUT4 at the muscle. The reason exercise is able to open GLUT4 or translocate it and get the glucose in without insulin is because of AMPK. So it's that interesting paradox of exercise where insulin comes down and yet glucose is taking in more, the muscle's taking in more glucose than it ever was. It's because of this kind of back door of the muscle exercising. AMPK gets turned on through a series of events that moves GLUT4. Well, apple cider vinegar will do the same thing in the absence of exercise, albeit to a more modest degree. So that's a couple mechanisms among others, including mitochondrial biogenesis and a little bit of uncoupling, where apple cider vinegar is one of my favorites, where if you take a couple tablespoons before your most starchy meal, you absolutely could compare the glucose curve from one day to the next, and you'll see that it's significantly lower with just that tart little bit of drinking. Beta-hydroxybutyrate, one of the ways that main ketone, not that we've talked about ketones, but some of my work is on ketones. I've wondered in the past, the ketone is unique because on one hand, it's a nutrient, it's a calorie to be burned, but at the other hand, it's a signaling molecule, and it is known to elicit some of its signaling like anti-inflammatory effects and antioxidant effects. Part of it is through changes elicited because of a G protein coupled receptor, where it does have a cell surface receptor that it will activate. I don't know the degree to which acetic acid may do the same thing, but with regards to beta-hydroxybutyrate, even exogenous ketones, that wasn't one you mentioned, but there are increasing studies showing that you can have, there was just a study in women with PCOS. The only intervention was to give them exogenous ketones, and every outcome related to metabolic markers and PCOS got better. And the only change was the supplementation with exogenous ketones. I don't know that that was an effect of the bioenergetics of the ketone. It was probably more of the signaling effect. And so that would be another thing if a person's becoming increasingly curious about ketones. And that's not without justification. The evidence supporting the value of ketones is growing and growing quickly, and it ought to. I have never in the past wanted to be seen as a drum-beating advocate of a ketogenic diet, simply knowing that that's not everyone's cup of tea. But increasingly, I will vigorously defend ketones as very beneficial, viable signaling molecules in the body. So even when it comes to controlling the metabolic response, you're probably going to eat less because ketones have a very satiating effect, more so than, say, glucose does. But then they also will impact mitochondrial uncoupling and help the body burn through that glucose faster.
No, it's interesting. Ketones are definitely signaling molecules, and I also think there's a lot of overlap between lactate and beta hydroxybutyrate as well. I mean, they're activating a lot of the same like brain-derived neurotrophic factor being one.
Agreed.
That, you know,
well, this is where exogenous ketones, I think, become so helpful. Where if you have someone who just says, "I just don't want to do the ketogenic diet, but I still would like some of the benefits." There are so many good options nowadays that I think it becomes a viable approach for someone to say, I want the ketones, but I don't want ketogenic, so I'm just going to drink them. Earlier in our discussion, I mentioned on one of my many tangents, Dr. George Cahill's work, and he was really one of the more famous, prominent, what they called at the time starvation scientists. We would call fasting scientists. But that same study I mentioned where it made you wonder, why was it that these patients who got down to 20 milligrams per deciliter of glucose, many people will say that's lethal, like it'll kill you. And yet they not only didn't die, they had no cognitive deficit whatsoever. The speculation, I don't know whether it was him or maybe Richard Veach in a sort of follow-up commentary, a ketone scientist who's also passed away now, where if the brain has adapted to ketones, it may be more resilient to tolerate a low glucose. But most people, one, haven't adapted to ketones, and two, don't even have any ketones. That's the problem, is because the same intervention, for the most part, that's going to drop the glucose in someone, like someone who eats a really sugary meal or drinks it, their glucose is going to come up, and the higher it goes, usually the lower it's going to go at the end, where you have a rebound hypoglycemia. You would say, well, I should be able to weather that drop because I have ketones. No, because the same thing that's helping you reverse your glucose, the high insulin, is going to inhibit ketogenesis. And so you've deprived your brain in that acute moment of its primary fuels, glucose and ketones, although the brain does use lactate as a fuel as well, albeit to lower levels. But if glucose and ketones have started to go low, that's going to be a panic at the brain, because that is its two primary fuels. And as I mentioned earlier, the brain doesn't have a reservoir of stored energy, a very, very modest amount, but its metabolic rate is so high that it needs constant supply. So why is it that Singapore 15 years ago was recruiting young scientists to come do diabetes research? Where you look at the average body weight in Singapore, and by American, US standards, they're very lean people. And that's reflective of all East Asians and many South Asians as well. So India up through Japan and the Koreas. Why is it that these are people with such low body weights and even low body fat levels, and yet their diabetes rates are way higher than we have in the US? And that is the difference in how people store fat. So if a human body is gaining fat mass, it will gain that fat mass through two different mechanisms. It will either be a function of multiplying the fat cells, so the person will have the ability to make new fat cells. That's called hyperplasia. And when the fat is undergoing hyperplasia, the size of the fat cell is staying very modest. So the size of each individual fat cell is small. There are just a lot more of them. On the other hand, you could have someone who's storing more of their fat through hypertrophy, where the number of fat cells is not changing, but the size is. The hypertrophic fat cell is a very sick fat cell for two reasons. And then I'll explain the ethnic predispositions because of it. So firstly, the fatter the fat cell gets, the more insulin resistant it becomes to prevent further fat growth. So to say that all another way, a fat cell can undergo more expansion than any other cell in the body that I'm aware of. It can get 20 times bigger than its original volume. And as it starts to reach this point of maximum dimension, it has to start limiting its growth. And so it becomes insulin resistant to stop growing. But at the same time, it starts to become hypoxic, where the fat cell has become so big that they've pushed each other too far from capillaries. and now it can't get the oxygen from the capillaries. And so it starts releasing a bunch of pro-inflammatory cytokines because some of them will work like a trail of breadcrumbs, resulting in one capillary having a little budding capillary grow off and follow the cytokines to the hypoxic or suffocating fat cell. So the hypertrophic fat cell becomes insulin resistant to stop growth, and it becomes pro-inflammatory to try to correct blood flow. All of which results in a very insulin resistant, on the course to cardiometabolic disease body. Now, back to the various ethnicities. Some ethnicities, like whites and blacks, have the ability to make new fat cells. So these are ethnicities that can be a little fatter than other ethnicities and yet have lower levels of insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. And that's what we see in the US. High rates of obesity, but relatively modest rates of type 2 diabetes. As much as we think the problem is bad here, I think the US ranks somewhere in the 70s. If you look at all the countries in the world and how diabetic they are, we're about number 70. Whereas Singapore, for example, and Japan is not too far back, Singapore is, I think, number 9. In all the countries of the Middle East are actually numbers 1 through 8 are like Oman, Dubai, Jordan, these countries in the Middle East. And then the other countries sort of round out through Southeast Asia and the Middle East and the Pacific Islands, the most diabetic places. These ethnicities, especially, so India is among the highest, most diabetic countries on the planet. East Asia, Southeast Asia, their fat cells on average are significant. The one paper I'm recalling where it took Caucasian men and South Asian men and did an adipose subcutaneous biopsy, and it found that the average South Asian man had adipocytes that were about 4 times larger volumetrically than the fat cells in the Caucasian at the same body size, same body fat percent. They just had much bigger fat cells. So to say all this another way, or to start to wrap it all up, what is more problematic about fat storage? It's not the mass of fat that matters most, but the size of each fat cell when it comes to slow insulin resistance and the consequences of too much fat mass. And this explains why, say, an East Asian fellow will just be moderately overweight compared to his obese Caucasian counterpart, and yet he has all of the complications of insulin resistance, and this guy just doesn't look good in his Speedo and is otherwise fine metabolically. It's because his fat cells are small, because he has so many of them. His fat cells are so few, but they're much larger. And so he has a lower body fat mass, but it's more harmful because his fat cells are bigger. And that is the problem with visceral fat. There's nothing inherently pathogenic about visceral fat. Those fat cells aren't mystically harmful. It's just that visceral cavity is so limited in volume that it only allows fat growth through hypertrophy, because that is a way to limit the total amount of fat you can grow. If our visceral fat was able to grow through hyperplasia, then it may expand so much that it starts to compress our tissues. It starts to squeeze the liver or squeeze the intestines or squeeze the kidneys. And so by only allowing visceral fat to grow through hypertrophy, you do limit how much it can grow, but it also becomes much more pro-inflammatory because hypertrophic fat cells release a lot more pro-inflammatory cytokines than smaller hyperplastic fat cells. So there's very much a genetic, ethnic component to this that influences how ethnicities are able to stimulate the growth of new fat cells. And then there's absolutely a sex component to it as well, which of course is still genetic, where women, because of the effects of estrogens, are able to stimulate a higher degree of hyperplasia than her male counterparts are. And so women will have that ability to, and this explains why the average woman both has higher fat than her male counterpart, and yet is healthier in every single cardiometabolic metric. If it was just a matter of fat mass, then women should be dying more from all these cardiometabolic diseases, and yet they're not. It's men, because women will have more fat cells, but smaller, because of estrogens. Men have relatively lower levels of estrogen, so we don't have that hyperplasia as much as the females do. So if we're getting fatter, it's more through hypertrophy relative to the ladies. The problem with that hypertrophic fat cell is that insulin is trying to still force feed it to store more fat. And insulin's main mechanism of promoting fat storage is by inhibiting lipolysis. So insulin will promote the growth of the fat cell. It does enable the feeding to some degree, but its most powerful effect is blocking the breakdown. And so the fat cell is saying, insulin, you keep telling me to grow. I can't. If I continue to grow, I mean, it literally gets to the point where the membrane can start to fray. It can't hold itself together. It's like a balloon that's being filled too much. And so it becomes insulin resistant, which is manifested as insulin not being able to inhibit lipolysis. Now we have a metabolic milieu that's quite odd, where you have high insulin and high free fatty acids. That does not happen unless the fat cells are insulin resistant. So just to make that clear, in a fasted state or a low carb state, insulin is low, and so you have more lipolysis, so free fatty acids will be higher. That's a very common feature. This is the fasted state. Low insulin, high free fatty acids. In contrast, the fed state, especially if it has some carbs, now insulin has gone up, it's inhibited lipolysis, and so free fatty acids will be down. This is the normal. It's one or the other, unless the fat cells are insulin resistant. Now you have high insulin, reflective of insulin resistance, but it can't inhibit lipolysis, thus we have high free fatty acids. This is a problem back to the ectopic aspect that you'd mentioned earlier, where normally if free fatty acids are high, the muscle will just burn it. And the muscle will happily burn free fatty acids, or any tissue, any cell with the mitochondria would burn it. But if insulin's elevated, you can't burn fat. Then fat burning, beta oxidation has been inhibited at virtually every single step with high insulin. So now we are storing more fat as triglycerides, which is the ectopic fat deposition. So that's where you start to have fatty liver. In fact, the main cause of fatty liver is spillover from fat cells, especially visceral fat. That's the main origin of all that fat. As much as we talk about fructose and other nutritional variables, and those matter, the majority of it is fat that's leaking out from the fat cell. And because insulin's high, it can't burn it. Normally, the liver would take those fatty acids and just say, well, I'm going to burn it into ketones. But if insulin's elevated, it can't happen. The liver has to store it. The pancreas starts to store it. But as I mentioned earlier, the triglycerides are not the cause of insulin resistance, but now we have the high insulin, which is an acute cause of insulin resistance, and a lot of free fatty acids. And where some of those are going to be palmitate, because palmitate is some of the stored triglycerides, you have palmitate coming out, that will directly be activating TLR4, the receptor that's going to then drive ceramides to be synthesized. So you have a lot, and not to mention the inflammatory cytokines that are also being released from the hypertrophic fat cell at the same time, also stimulating ceramide accrual. Thus, we end up having the perfect metabolic milieu to promote insulin resistance, and it all started because the fat cells got too big.
And not to mention with the cytokine signaling, you're talking about now the chronic inflammation.
Yeah.
I mean, there's studies now linking visceral fat to cancer.
Yeah, that's right.
And so it's the brain, the cancer incidence, it's all
atherosclerosis.
Atherosclerosis.
Yeah, I mean, C-reactive protein is a better predictor of heart disease than LDL cholesterol is. And the fat cell is the main source of a protein called plasminogen activator inhibitor 1, PAI1, whose main job is to erode clots as they form. So why is it that bigger fat cells relate so well with stroke and cardiovascular disease? Because you are producing a protein that's inhibiting the breakdown of clots, making it just more likely that someone's going to have a stroke.
What other factors play a role? Because, I mean, is there a dietary? Is there, some other factors that are also contributing to that?
There is, yeah. I'll just mention one just for the sake of time, which actually is linoleic acid. So my view on seed oils is that they can contribute to insulin resistance through a secondary route by influencing the dynamics of the fat cell. Specifically, when linoleic acid is taken into the cell, one of its peroxide metabolites that it can turn into is a molecule called 4-HNE. And 4-HNE has been shown to inhibit the fat cell's potential for hyperplasia, thus forcing the fat cell to only go down hypertrophy. So if there is some nutritional link that can drive fat cell storage into one versus the other, linoleic acid does have that effect. Linoleic acid being converted to 4-HNE will inhibit the adapogenic hyperplastic signaling and only enable the hypertrophic signal of the fat cell.
Is that dose dependent? Like, are you going to get that if you're eating, I don't want people to be scared to eat like walnuts
Yeah,
I mean,
for sure it would be. I don't know. I can't quantify the dose, but yeah, in general, my view, you and I were chatting earlier, linoleic acid is ubiquitous in nature.
you need it. You need your
it
cell
is-
membranes.
Yes, you have to have it. So as much as I'm talking about it and invoking it as a problem, I think it's very appropriate for you to say, yeah, but it also, like, it's in mother's milk, for goodness sakes. It's in every meat source. And I'm a huge defender of meat. I think meat is very healthy, and yet you're going to have linoleic acid in it. I would maybe not counter, by just stating that those also, in nature, when you have the omega-6 linoleic acid, you often also have an omega-3 that comes with it. That, to me, is key. That if you're, and often it'll have some degree, even minuscule levels of vitamin E. Vitamin E will help that linoleic acid not go down the pathway of peroxidation. It'll help it just go down the pathway of oxidation even. Dr. Stephen Cunnane, this incredible man, just a delightful individual, he's done a lot of work documenting the fact that linoleic acid, when it's allowed to just be burned for fuel, burns so high and so rapid that it allows the brain to create its own ketones. He has a fascinating area of research on this. So I've always tried to have a little bit of a nuanced view of linoleic acid in that it's everywhere. But when we get it in nature, it'll come with an omega-3 and it'll come with some amount of often vitamin E, which will help prevent the linoleic acid from going down the pathway of becoming a villain, which it can. Linoleic acid will undergo peroxidation very readily and become a very harmful series of metabolites that are harmful to cell membranes and mitochondrial membranes.